about how Zoroastrian and Greek and Egyptian influences came into Judaism. The early Jews did not have a Satan. Did you know that? There was no personal Satan. That word just meant adversary. But after they were taken captive into Babylonia, they came back with some Zoroastrian ideas. And then you find in the Old Testament talk about this Satan character. Look at this well-known contradiction in the Bible. 2 Samuel 24:1 says, "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David to say, 'Go number Israel and Judah.'" In other words, to take a census. See, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. He moved David to do it. But look at 1 Chronicles 21:1, which is a retelling of the same story years later. "And Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel." Satan enters the Old Testament after the Babylonian captivity, after the Jews got there and learned about this Zoroastrian idea of this counter God, this big cosmic Satan God. And you can understand why there's a contradiction here, because the later writers now had an idea about Satan, and so they contradicted the early writers. We find many contradictions in the Bible that are explained by the development of the faith. And Christianity, of course, inherited all of that. Let me skip a lot of this, because this is a 20-minute opening for something else. We find also Pythagorean idea, the sacred number 153 that was secret, the number of the fish that was secret. You find in the book of John when Jesus told the disciples to cast their fish and bring back the number of fish, just like Pythagoras told his disciples to go out fishing and bring back the fish, but he wouldn't tell the number. In the New Testament, their number is told. And what is the number of fish? 153. Have you ever wondered why that's in the Bible? That's a pagan number that was put into the Bible. It was the secret number that wasn't supposed to be told, but the Gospel writers told it. There are many Christian scholars who examine the pagan origins of Christianity. Everett Ferguson is one, a Bible-believing Christian. At the end of this huge book, like 700 pages of comparing Christianity with pagan mythology, he could not find one single thing that was unique, that was different. He said Christian claims rest on whether it's a revelation from God, not on its originality. Neither the truth nor the value of Christianity depends on its uniqueness, he said. He could not quote one idea out of the New Testament that was unique compared to previous Christianity. In fact, a 2nd century Christian named Justin Martyr, who had been a pagan, who converted to Christianity, he was arguing with the Romans, and he was saying, listen, you Romans should accept Christianity because you know why? There's nothing different. Christianity is not any different. Here's what Justin Martyr said. When we Christians say, where did it go? Here we go. When we Christians say,
this is the last point.
This is it, yeah, I'm done. When we Christians say that the Word, who was the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, and that Jesus Christ was crucified and rose again, ascended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem to be sons of Jupiter. Wicked devils penetrated. If we assert that the Word of God was born in a particular manner, let this, as above, be no extraordinary thing to you, who say that Mercury is the Word of God, the Logos, the Word of God. So let me put it to you this way. If an early Christian, the early church, the early follower of Jesus in the 2nd century said that Christianity is nothing different from early paganism, who are we to disagree?
We now have our first rebuttal from Greg Clarke.
Dan, no one thinks the Three Little Pigs existed. There are no university departments of Three Little Pig study. But all over the world, people study the life of Jesus Christ. Ancient historians study the life of Jesus Christ, whether they're believers or not. It seems to me the thrust of your argument is that Christianity is not the one true faith because it's like the other myths. That seems to me to be the summary of the whole range of things that you have thrown at us now. But to say that puts you out on a limb of scholarship among mainstream historians when it comes to the life of Jesus. Most historians, the majority shall we say, or even a large number, take the New Testament record of Jesus and the assorted references to in the other ancient literature seriously as genuine historical references. to a real person. So I just want it to be clear here, it did sound a little Dan Brown rather than Dan Barker in a lot of that it's a kind of conspiracy theory to suggest that Jesus is like the three little pigs. Universities all over the world take seriously the New Testament record of Jesus as witness to a real person in a real time that can be studied through historical method as well as theology. I do feel in Dan's approach that he reveals something of the damage of fundamentalism in American thinking and in other places around the world, of course. Because it does feel to me, and I hope this doesn't sound offensive, because it's not meant to be at all, but it's a way of thinking that can be identified, that there's an approach to the Bible and to philosophy and to truth-seeking that has carried over from fundamentalist teachings of Dan's past to the way he's thinking now. The kind of scattergun approach to sort of proof texting your argument rather than building it up. The use of the kind of preacherly story of belittling rather than making the case. It worries me that these are the means by which we're trying to have our discussion here today, because there are other ways to do it. Another point I want to make relates more generally to God. You began not addressing the topic of Christianity and the true faith, but the existence of God, to throw that dust in the air. No Christian thinks God can be seen down a telescope. That's not where you find God. You don't look in the corners of the universe for God. In fact, in the monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, all teach that God is different in substance to nature. He created the world is the word that's used, and it's such a difficult word to use these days that brings in all sorts of politicking about creationism that I really don't believe in and don't want to get into. But God as the ultimate beginning, God as the mind, capital M, that's the kind of thing that Christians, Jews and Muslims argue grounds a belief in God. You can't look down a telescope or a microscope and find God. There are good arguments for God's existence, and I would encourage people here, and perhaps Dan, if he's interested, to read Keith Ward's response to Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. It's called by Keith Ward, who has just retired, Professor of Philosophy and Theology at Oxford University as well, Why There Almost Certainly Is a God, where he shows that the arguments for God's existence still are in operation. They're not knockdown proofs like in maths. They're pointers. They're reasons to demonstrate why you would believe that there is a God. Those arguments, we actually got to interview him, Centre for Public Christianity, got to interview him in Oxford. And my friend John, who's a co-director with me, asked Professor Ward a question just at the beginning, do you like any of the arguments for God's existence? And the Professor of Philosophy said, actually, I pretty much like them all. And that's my position as well. I pretty much like them all, with a few exceptions. But there are ways of thinking about why you would have a rational basis for a belief in God. Christianity is, in fact, more unique in its teachings than Dan would suggest from the studies that he's looked at. After all, some of the teachings of Jesus were so unique, considered so bizarre, that they crucified him for them. They were so radical that they thought he was no longer a Jew, he was teaching a new religion. Jesus' teachings were unique in areas of understanding how humans should relate to each other. Love your enemies, not just your neighbour. More than the golden rule. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, says Jesus. Jesus, it can be argued, is the grounds for why we now in Western society at least, and other societies too, hold humility in such high esteem. In the ancient world, humility was no virtue. Jesus has something to do with a change, a profound change in our understanding of what it is that matters about human relations. There's incredible uniqueness to the teachings of Jesus. The kinds of myths that were brought up by Dan are known to be myths. They're known as myths. I've heard Dan before say to people, do you believe in the God Thor? I don't believe in the God Thor. Well, Dan obviously just believes in one less God than me. But everyone knows that Thor was mythological. We know from the beginning that these are myths. Christianity, uniquely in my understanding, suggests that you can know God through history, through a person, an individual, in a place, in a time. It's a scandalous claim. It's called the incarnation. The idea that God might be possibly known through a human being. It's scandalous, but it's amenable to reason, because it's how we know things. We know things through others who are like us, who communicate to us in matters we understand. It makes sense if there is a God, that he would communicate with people through a person. There are no Apollonian churches today, as far as I know. The strength of Christian teaching was that it survived down the centuries. There was more to the Jesus story that meant people believed it to the point of martyrdom. So many people put their hands up as messiahs in the first century. Very few of them survived to ground a movement that would become the basis of hope for a third of the world's population. Christians, I'll wrap up. Last point. Christians, okay, good point to finish on. Christians weren't idiots then, and I hope we're not idiots today. Paul said, look, we're to be pitied if this Jesus thing didn't happen. We're to be pitied if it didn't happen. So history is very important. C.S. Lewis put it beautifully. He said, the things that look like myth in the Christian story are actually fact in the history of Jesus. The myths are a grounding for some of human desires, but they're known as myths. Christianity teaches uniquely that the myth became fact in Jesus of Nazareth.
The strength of Muslim teaching is that it survived. Muhammad was a historical person. It spawned a worldwide religion in which people have given their lives and devoted their lives to it. If it's true that if there's smoke, there's fire, then Islam is the one true religion. Joseph Smith was a historical person. Mormonism has survived. The fact that Jesus may have been a historical person, and by the way, in my book, I argue for the very low probability of the existence of a historical Jesus, although he may have existed. You can't disprove that. There were other first-century self-proclaimed messiahs as well. There was a Theodos the Christ. Josephus writes about a Judas the Christ. There was an Egyptian Jew Messiah. So, yeah, this Jesus person may have existed, but the Jesus of the New Testament is a later, embellished, exaggerated cartoon character based on perhaps the historical existence of a man named Jesus. Greg only gave us one evidence for Christianity, and basically his argument was that all scholars and all believers accept Jesus as historical, but he only gave us one evidence. He told us that we should go back to the earliest beliefs in the Gospels and Acts, but then he presented to us an epistle. The very first thing written about the resurrection of Jesus, and Greg is correct, was written around the year 55 AD, which would have been about at least a quarter of a century after the events happened, written to a group of people that were 1,500 miles away by land after it happened, who had no way of verifying this, and using words that were not bodily resurrection or bodily appearances or even a bodily resurrection. He used the word in 1 Corinthians 15, not anastasis. Paul knew that word. He used the word egiro. Jesus awoke. When Jesus awoke on the boat, he used that same word, egiro. Then, when he says he appeared, he didn't say it was a physical, historical appearance. It was a visionary. That word opthi comes from the Greek orao, which is the word they used for visionary experiences. So it's like Grandma rose to heaven, right, when she died. Not bodily, but Christians believe that her spirit rose, and that then you could have a visionary talk with Grandma, just like on the Mount of Transfigurations. Moses and Elijah appeared unto the disciples. No one thinks they were bodily there, and even Paul tells us exactly what it means, because at the end of that list of 1 Corinthians 15, he says, he also appeared unto me. That same word appeared. We know that Paul did not bodily meet Jesus. He saw something in the sky, and he heard something. It was a visionary, spiritual thing that happened. If you want to go back to the earliest beliefs of the earliest Christians, then the earliest Christians did not believe in a bodily resurrection of Jesus. They believed that when he died, he ascended spiritually into heaven. The Roman historian Suetonius wrote in clear detail that Caesar Augustus, when he died, ascended up into heaven. Does anyone think that Caesar Augustus bodily went to heaven, or that he spiritually ascended? The mistake that Greg is making is he's taking the later Christian writings, the Gospels, which started in 70, 80, 85, and then John later in 90, shoehorning them back. He's ignoring the early Christians. He's taking the exaggerated, legendary, myth-making ideas of later believers through the end of that century, and thinking that when Paul wrote the very first thing around the year 55, he was talking